This is a brief presentation on the difference between per capita and per Stirpes distribution options, and it comes into play when in a last will and testament or a living trust we need to decide what to do with the lion's share of the estate. It's usually in a residue clause. So example would be I want to leave everything to my wife, but if my wife predeceased me to my children, I have 3 children, and one of those children predeceased me as well. So what do I do with that deceased child's share? And the terms that lawyers use, per capita or per Stirpes. So the way I learn is through example. So let's start an example to illustrate and talk about the differences. To illustrate, let's start with the hypothetical of John and Jane Sample. Here's their family tree. So let's suppose John Sample died. Let's go back. So John and Jane are married, have been married for a long time. They have 3 children, Joe, Tiffany, and Paul. Joe has 2 children, Fred and Wilma. And Tiffany married a man named Smith, so her name is Tiffany Sample Smith. She has 1 child named Brittany. And Paul, another child of John and Jane, has no children. So John and Jane have 3 kids, and they have 3 grandchildren. And unfortunately, John Sample died on December 1st, 2012. His will provided that upon his death, his estate shall distribute to his wife, Jane. Very, very typical. Unfortunately, Jane passed away shortly thereafter, January 1st, 2014. And the question is, well, how should she distribute her estate, the second spouse to die? And almost, most cases when the second spouse dies, the mother or the surviving spouse wants the estate to pass equally to children. Now, we talked about specific distributions, but in our example, she intends her 3 children, Joe, Tiffany, and Paul, to inherit equally. However, the question is, what if one of the children, or all, but let's say, for our example, one, let's pick on poor Joe here. What happens if Joe passed away first? So Joe Sample, in our hypothetical, passed before, predeceased his mother, and he has 2 children, Fred and Wilma. Now, the first concept to learn is per capita. So in our example, Joe, I put the big X through Joe. That means he's predeceased. So when Jane passes away, what happens to Joe's inheritance? Well, per capita means by the head, and it means that Joe's inheritance shall pass to his siblings, not his children. And so each one of so Joe, Tiffany, and Paul would normally be entitled to 1/3 of the estate. When Joe passed away first, his 1/3 under a per capita distribution will go to Tiffany and Paul. So they inherit their brother's 1/3 share. So normally they would get 1/3. Now they're getting 1/3 plus half of Joe's 1/3, which means Tiffany and Paul inherit 50-50 equally. And the bad thing about per capita distribution is that the grandchildren here, Joe's children, are disinherited. They won't receive any inheritance. That's why the more popular distribution, and I'm talking like 99% of folks who, in fact more than that, it's like almost everyone chooses per Stirpes, because they want these grandchildren to inherit in the shoes of their deceased parent. So let's look at per Stirpes. So here we have, remember, John, Grandpa John passed away December 1st, 2012. Jane passed away January 1st, 2014. In our example, Joe passed away. Normally, the 3 kids, Joe, Tiffany, and Paul, would each receive 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. If this was per capita, Joe's 1/3 would go to his his brothers and sisters, so they'd get 50-50. Under a per capita distribution, Joe's 1/3 goes to his children 50-50 equally. That's called a per stirpes distribution. And so on the Living Care Learning form, we ask you to choose in the event that one of your heirs passes away. Do you want it per capita, per stirpes? Most people choose per stirpes because they don't want their grandchildren or the child of the predeceased parent to lose their inheritance. So that is the difference between per stirpes and per capita. Once again, most people choose per stirpes, so think about that. And then, of course, the last choice is if one of these children predecease, well, we don't want to do per stirpes or per capita. We just want to name a different person. I've never actually seen that happen, but it's an option available to you, and you get to decide how you want to do that.